Good evening, my dears. Today we return to a world without electric light, where shadows stretched longer and time seemed slower. Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts settle like dust on a tapestry untouched for centuries. The flickering light of history before you. This is a boring bedtime story, a banquet at which guests were burned alive. A story not of drama for drama's sake, but of how quickly joy can turn to silence. How even at festive times, shadows in the corners of great halls can change everything. And when the last candle flickers faintly and the hall falls silent again, I hope you will feel yourself, gently, immersed in peace. If this quiet story finds you well tonight, remember to leave a small trace of yourself. Like a fingerprint on wax or a name on old parchment. Leave a comment to let me know how you enjoyed this story. Share it with someone who might be awake when they'd rather be. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing to join me for the next slow-paced story unfolding. Now, let's get started. The night air in Paris was unusually mild for January, the year being 1393. In the reign of King Charles VI of France. The Seine moved sluggishly, its dark surface reflecting no stars, only the faint flicker of torchlight from the stone bridges. Far from the riverbank, behind the thick walls of the Hotel Saint-Paul, the king's favored residence in the city, preparations for a celebration were quietly nearing completion. The occasion was a wedding. Not of royalty, but of a noble lady-in-waiting to Queen Isabeau, one of the many women who moved through the long galleries of the palace like carefully arranged embroidery. The queen, ever fond of merriment and spectacle, had insisted on a masked ball, a bal des ardents, a ball of the burning ones, though no one expected the name to take on a chilling new meaning by night's end. Inside the grand hall of the Hotel Saint-Paul, the preparations were almost finished. The stone walls were hung with tapestries, their heavy folds rich with depictions of forest hunts, saints in gold thread halos, and allegorical scenes of virtue and vice. Their colors, even by the dim orange light of torches, appeared lush and warm, reds like garnet, greens like pine, and blues as soft as the evening. On the floor below them, servants moved slowly but deliberately, setting long wooden tables with pewter goblets, trenchers of bread, and small glazed earthenware pots of honeyed fruit. The servants' feet made only the slightest whisper on the flagstones. Occasionally, one paused to straighten a silver candlestick or to adjust the folds of a cloth. The rhythm of preparation was steady and unhurried, the kind of still energy that precedes a festivity. In a far corner of the hall, a harpist sat tuning her strings. The notes drifted faintly, a ripple of quiet sound amid the flicker of torches. She was older, her back bent gently with time, her fingers careful as they tested the tension of each string. She did not look up when courtiers entered and crossed behind her. Somewhere beyond the outer doors, the scent of winter crept in. Wood smoke, damp wool, and frost, though it was quickly swallowed by the warmer scents within. Roasted meat from the kitchens, beeswax from the candles, and dried rosemary scattered on the floors. A large fire had already been lit in the hearth. It gave more smoke than flame, being recently stoked, and the smell of it drifted upward to mingle with the faded spices of the tapestries. Shadows danced gently along the beams of the ceiling, stretching out like the arms of forgotten saints. No one hurried. No voices rose above a murmur. This was not yet the time for revelry. It was the hush before it, when the world holds its breath. Outside the palace, the city remained in winter darkness. The muddy streets of Paris lay quiet, broken only by the soft creak of wagon wheels or the bark of a dog in some alley far off. Most of the population had gone to bed, wrapped in rough wool, lulled by the cold and the tolling of the last bell. But within the thick walls of the palace, light held its vigil. In a narrow chamber lit by a single oil lamp, several young courtiers crowded together in conspiratorial whispers. The air was close, filled with the heat of too many bodies and the faint scent of scented oils. Laughter hovered just below the surface, suppressed behind gloved hands and arched brows. Tonight, they had decided, would not be merely festive, it would be amusing. And that meant costumes, not the refined silks of Italy or the layered velvets of Burgundy, but something more outlandish. Beasts. A courtier with pale hair and a sharp chin unrolled a bundle of cloth that had been hidden under the bench. He lifted from it a shapeless, hairy garment, a suit made of coarse flax soaked in resin and pitch, the fabric studded with tow and bits of hemp to mimic wild fur. It stank faintly of tallow and smoke. "You shall be the bear," he said, handing it off to one of his companions. Another suit followed, a wolf, a wild man, a goat, and finally, a fantastical creature that might have been some chimera of the forest. Together, they would dance into the feast as savages of the woods, leaping and howling, delighting the noble guests with their folly. Among them was King Charles VI himself. He had agreed to join the masquerade against the advice of several physicians and his own counselors. The king had not been well for some time, prone to long silences and sudden terrors. But tonight, he was calm, his pale blue eyes watchful and untroubled. As he allowed the costume to be fastened about him, he looked almost like a boy, slim, light-haired, and distant, as though the world around him were only a tapestry, something to gaze upon, but never truly feel. The suits were rough and hot, their surfaces bristling with dried fibers. Masks were added last, leather pieces daubed with soot and ash, covering the eyes and nose, giving each dancer the semblance of some wild thing, half man and half beast. The plan was simple. They would enter the feast chained together, pretending to be wild men brought from the woods. They would dance in a circle, shrieking and capering, until the queen gave the signal to unmask. It was harmless folly. A servant knocked once, then opened the door. "Your Majesty," he said softly, "they are ready for your entrance?" The king nodded once. The others followed suit. There was no drumbeat, no music yet, only the sound of footsteps and the muffled scrape of the rough suits brushing stone walls. Down the corridor, the light of the great hall glimmered at the end like a pool of amber. When the dancers entered, the room did not erupt in surprise. The guests were too well-mannered for that. But heads turned and murmurs spread like a breeze among the tablecloths. The figures were strange, bestial, their movements jerky and exaggerated. They snarled and clawed at each other, stumbling in their chains as they circled the hearth at the center of the hall. Some of the ladies tittered, covering their mouths with jeweled fingers. A few older knights looked on with faint amusement, though others narrowed their eyes in distaste. It was a game for the young, clearly. Queen Isabeau, seated on a cushioned dais, leaned forward slightly, her eyes bright with approval. She clapped her hands once, and the harpist in the corner began to play a sprightly tune. The dancers responded immediately. They howled in unison, a sound more comic than frightening, and leapt into a spinning ring. Their arms flailed, their feet stamped the stone with dull thuds, and the fabric of their costumes rustled with each movement. The king, among them, moved less energetically than the others. His steps were slower, more deliberate, but he turned with the group, keeping to the rhythm. From a distance, he was indistinguishable from the others. Just another creature of the woods, lost in play. Servants moved along the edges of the room, topping off goblets, replacing trenchers, whispering quietly. The fire in the central hearth crackled gently. Sparks rose from the dry wood, catching briefly in the air, before dissolving into darkness above. A young nobleman, late to the feast and perhaps already half in his cups, entered from a side door. Seeing the scene, he paused, then laughed aloud. What madness is this? A lady at a nearby table murmured something, but he did not hear. Instead, he stepped closer to the hearth, peering at the dancers. The flames caught in the metal of his belt buckle and reflected in his eyes. He held a torch. The torch flame wavered as he moved. One of the dancers paused, looking toward him, though the mask made it hard to see. "Stay back," someone said quietly. But the young man only smiled and held his torch higher. Perhaps he meant to light a rushlight. Perhaps he thought it part of the game. There was a flick of his wrist, a faint hiss. And then the world changed. The resin-soaked flax of one costume caught the fire in an instant. The flame leapt, hungry and quick, devouring the dry fibers like parchment. A moment later, the heat bloomed outward. The circle broke as dancers screamed and stumbled, their movements no longer playful. One fell. Another tripped over him. A third tried to beat at the flames with gloved hands. But the hall was large, and the air thick with smoke. It took long moments for the guests to understand what had happened. Then the panic began. Chairs overturned, goblets shattered. A woman fainted, her fan still in her lap. Servants rushed forward with cloaks and pitchers of water. Someone shouted for oil to be thrown on the fire, then someone else shouted not to. Amid it all, the king stood frozen, his arms half raised, the flames beginning to lick along one sleeve. It was quiet. Oddly quiet, the way a snowfall is quiet. And then the roaring came. The flames, once small, spread with a peculiar elegance. They moved along the resin-soaked fibers like dancers themselves, twirling upward, catching at hems, crawling toward hoods and sleeves. The smell of burning pitch rose sharply into the air, thick and cloying, mingling with the aromas of roasted meat and beeswax until the senses rebelled. Guests stumbled back, some with wide eyes, others with faces turned away. The harpist had long since stopped playing, her hands now gripping the edge of her stool, unmoving. One of the dancers shrieked, a sound that pierced the quiet like a bell in the fog. Two of the wild men were already on the floor, rolling, their suits hissing as the fire consumed the flax. Another had torn off part of his mask, revealing eyes rimmed with smoke and sweat. A fourth, perhaps the goat, had begun running, crashing blindly into the edge of the table, scattering trenchers and candlesticks in his wake. The queen remained seated, unmoving for several seconds, as though unwilling to accept that the spectacle had turned real. It was only when a figure collapsed not far from her dais, his costume ablaze, that she stood, pale and blinking, and called for help. "Bring water," she said. But the words came too softly. Servants rushed forward with ewers and cloths, too small to do much good. One clever page tugged down a heavy woolen tapestry, and threw it over a burning dancer, stamping frantically at the bulk beneath. The fire hissed in protest. Above, the timbers of the ceiling remained untouched, but the heat was rising. Smoke gathered in the beams, curling like silk ribbon. The king, still silent, staggered back from the flames, his arm now alight. A knight named Jean de Nantouillet grabbed him by the waist and pulled, dragging him toward the edge of the hall. Others rushed to help. One flung a tablecloth over the king, smothering the fire as gently as if wrapping a child against the cold. He did not speak. Eventually, the flames died down. The remaining dancers, those not burned or pulled free, lay motionless or whimpering on the floor. The chains that had once connected them had broken, leaving twisted links among the scorched footprints. Several guests had fainted. The air was still thick with smoke. Someone had opened the tall doors at the end of the hall, letting in cold night air that crept across the floor like a blanket of fog. No one danced. No one spoke above a whisper. A physician knelt beside one of the fallen dancers. He touched the man's face, gently lifting a corner of the burned mask. He did not speak, but only glanced at a servant nearby and shook his head. Elsewhere, 2 more men were being carried out on hastily fetched shutters. One murmured something through cracked lips. Another groaned softly. The queen had retired to an adjoining chamber, her face hidden behind a square of linen, her ladies clustered near, speaking in low tones. The king had been led away too, his arms wrapped in cloth soaked with cold wine. He had not spoken a word since the fire. The harpist had finally set her instrument aside. She sat with her back to the wall, her eyes closed, as though waiting for a different night to begin. The hall itself remained beautiful, in a way, if one did not look too closely. The tapestries on the far wall had been darkened with soot. A small trail of melted wax ran like a scar down the length of the main table. Outside, the wind shifted. The smoke curled out into the cold. Later that evening, a quiet fell so deep that even the pages dared not speak. Most of the guests had left the hall. Only a few remained, tending to those who had been injured. A priest was brought, not for a mass, but for whispered words at the bedsides of the badly burned. One of the dancers had died. His name was Ivan de Foix. He had been the one in the costume with the horns, perhaps the wild man, perhaps the goat. No one could say for certain. The masks had all burned alike. A second man, Emery de Poitiers, still breathed, but barely. He had inhaled the flame as much as been touched by it, and now each breath was like the drawing of parchment through fire. Charles VI, the king, was in his private chamber. He had not spoken, not even to his physician. He sat near the fire, though it had been reduced to embers, and watched the coals with hollow eyes. His sleeves were gone, burned to the elbow. His hands were wrapped in linen. A servant knelt by the hearth, gently turning the coals, careful not to let any smoke rise. Outside the window, snow had begun to fall. It landed softly on the stone sill, melted in rivulets that ran down into the dark. At dawn, the bells of the city rang, as they always did. The fires in the hall had been extinguished, but their marks remained. Blackened flags, scorched wood, and the faint smell of pitch that even the fresh air could not drive away. A scribe, with ink-stained fingers, was already beginning the record of the night. He sat at a small table in an outer chamber, noting names and details, his script precise and slow. He paused often to dip his quill and to blink smoke from his eyes. He recorded what he could. 4 men had danced in fire. 2 were dead. The king had been saved by brave hands. A torch had started it. But the names were not the whole story. Down in the kitchens, the servants spoke in low tones, not of the dead, but of how quickly it had all happened. One had seen a dancer try to climb into a wine barrel. Another swore a scream had echoed even after the fire was out. In the Queen's chamber, the ladies-in-waiting were quiet. The bride whose wedding had begun the night had not spoken since the fire. Her gown still smelled faintly of roses. Nothing was the same, and yet, outside the palace walls, the city stirred to its mourning with the usual indifference. Bread was baked, bells were rung, wool was spun. The feast was over. But its silence had only just begun. The day after the feast was unusually bright. Winter sun filtered through the tall windows of the palace, casting long columns of pale light upon the cold stone floors. The glass was clouded with condensation, but the brightness pressed through regardless, as though to erase the memory of the night before. Yet the memory lingered. Servants moved softly through the halls, their steps hushed, their eyes downcast. The usual rustle of linens, the scrape of buckets, and the knock of wood echoed faintly, as if even the sounds themselves had grown wary. In the gallery that overlooked the inner courtyard, a lone page stood sweeping. The broom stirred fine gray ash that had settled like dust from a forgotten comet. Now and then he paused to look out over the city, which sprawled peacefully in the distance, unaware or unconcerned. Near the chapel, two knights stood speaking in low voices. One held his helmet under his arm. The other rested his hand on the pommel of his sword. Their conversation was muted, full of pauses, their glances drifting toward the entrance of the royal apartments. A banner above the main staircase had been taken down. Its edge had caught fire during the frenzy, and now lay folded in a side chamber, its threads singed and the royal device partially obscured by soot. A laundress had tried to wash it, but the pitch had fused into the cloth. The tapestries remained, but their once vibrant colors seemed dimmer. No one lingered long beneath them. In the chancery, the work continued. Clerks with fur-lined robes bent over their desks, scratching with quills across stretched sheets of vellum. Wax seals cooled slowly on the edges of folded decrees. The light through the narrow windows lit the motes of dust that hung in the air like suspended breath. One document was being prepared for the Queen's signature, an official statement of mourning for those lost in the fire. Another would be sent to the families. Couriers waited outside the chamber, their horses saddled, eyes half closed against the sunlight. The clerk assigned to record the names paused often. He had seen the fire himself. He had ducked under a table when the flames spread. His hand trembled slightly each time he dipped the quill. Jean de Nantouillet, he whispered as he wrote. Yvain de Foix, Emery de Poitiers. The ink spread slowly across the vellum, names becoming memory. Across the corridor, black mourning cloth had been draped over the entrance to the Queen's apartments. A maidservant came and went, carrying a basin of rose water and a folded kerchief. Inside, the Queen sat with her head bowed, her fingers gently tracing the embroidery on her sleeve. The bride, still dressed in her wedding shift, slept on a low cot nearby, a bowl of lavender set by her pillow. No one spoke of the wedding. Not yet. Outside the palace, life continued. Market stalls opened. A chimney sweep trudged down the Rue Saint-Antoine, dragging a bundle of soot-stained rods behind him. Bakers folded dough and rang small bells to call early customers. But among the nobility, there was restraint. Social calls were canceled. Gloves were worn longer, voices were softened. A funeral procession moved through the city just after midday. It was small, discreet, with no drums or banners. 2 carts bore the bodies of the dancers who had not survived. Monks from a nearby abbey walked before them, chanting low prayers in Latin. A few courtiers followed behind, heads bowed beneath wide hoods. The snow had melted, but the cobbles were still damp, and the wheels turned slowly. Along the way, children watched from behind shutters. A woman crossed herself. A dog barked once, then fell silent. No announcement was made. No herald cried news. The procession simply passed. And then it was over. The bodies were laid to rest in consecrated ground. A brief mass was held. The wind stirred the cypress trees. Weeks passed. The hall where the fire occurred was cleaned, but never quite restored. The scorched stones remained darker than the rest. The smell of smoke returned when the room grew warm. The queen resumed her duties, though her laughter came less easily. The king spoke rarely, and his moments of clarity became fewer. He was often found sitting alone, looking at the fire, as if listening to something only he could hear. A new tapestry was commissioned. It would depict St. Denis guiding the dead through smoke to light. The weavers worked in silence, their fingers moving steadily, threading color into story. Some said the feast had been cursed. Others whispered of punishment, of omens. But most simply let the matter rest. In time, other feasts would be held. Other fires would be lit. But the feast of 1393 would be remembered not for its joy, but for its silence, for the hush that followed laughter, and for the way the light of torches can burn when left too close to men wrapped in pitch and folly. And so the candles burned low, and the world went on,